Kneel, trash, sweeper, Richard Kane sneered, shoving Marcus Reed hard onto the ice-cold concrete, right in front of his tightly bound son. You think a janitor like you can keep this secret? Hand over the pen, unless you want to collect your kid's body piece by piece. The entire underground parking garage held its breath. But just a few seconds later, in a single offbeat moment, Marcus lifted his head. His voice was low and final. You just made a mistake. No one knew that, while everyone else was looking at him as a defeated man. Marcus had heard something no one else could understand. A CEO was using sign language to signal for help. Help me. He has a weapon. And Marcus understood every single movement. Because he was not just a single father, Marcus Reed had once been an auditor, a man who specialized in hunting down fraud systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If you were Marcus, would you bow your head to save your child, or stand up and expose an entire filthy empire of power? Would you choose silence, or let justice be paid for in blood? Press subscribe now, and leave a comment with your choice. This story does not end here. The floor of the conference room on the 37th floor of Titan Finance was polished to a shine, reflecting even the crystal chandelier ceiling above. Marcus Reed bent low, pushing the mop forward in slow, steady rhythms. The familiar smell of floor-cleaning chemicals mixed with the lingering scent of expensive perfume left behind after the board meeting had just ended. The overhead lights revealed the premature strands of gray in his hair, standing out awkwardly in a space filled with perfectly tailored suits and leather shoes polished every single day. Marcus was used to this, used to lower his head, used to move so quietly that he almost made no sound at all, used to no one seeing him, or if they did, seeing him the way people look at an extra chair in a room. On Wall Street, where numbers worth millions of dollars are decided in a matter of minutes, a janitor is just part of the floor, existing to keep everything clean and to disappear before anyone feels annoyed. He stopped in front of the long walnut conference table and carefully wiped every edge. Marcus's hands were rough, calloused, the marks clearly visible. Few people knew that these hands had once flipped through thousands of pages of financial documents, had once traced money flows meticulously hidden inside major corporations. Now, their only task was to wipe away shoe marks and forgotten coffee stains. A dry sound echoed behind him. The utility cart shuddered slightly as the toe of a leather shoe lightly kicked one of its wheels. Marcus stopped moving, but did not turn around immediately. Richard Kane's voice rang out cold and sharp, as if the air itself froze with every word. Watch it. Don't dirty my shoes. Trash. Sweeper. Marcus turned, lowering his head a little more. Richard Kane stood there, hands in his pockets, his tie slightly crooked, like a deliberately placed sign of contempt. His eyes swept over Marcus, not to look at him, but to confirm his position. Beneath notice, a few employees lingering in the conference room chuckled softly. No one laughed out loud. They did not need to. A snort, a curled lip, was enough to show agreement. Marcus heard everything, but he remained silent. That silence was not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew that speaking would change nothing. Richard took a step closer and reached for the timesheet clipboard resting on the cart. He flipped through a few pages, then tossed it straight onto the floor in front of Marcus. Overtime tonight. Clean the entire east hallway. No pay. No opinions. Marcus looked at the paper at his feet, the printed letters, the blank lines waiting for a signature. He took a very light breath. In his mind flashed the image of Jamal sitting at the small dining table in their Brooklyn apartment, a worn hearing aid hooked behind his ear, eyes fixed on the door. Whenever evening approached, his mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, a question, an objection, or simply a request to leave early. But the sound never came. Marcus bent down and picked up the timesheet. Richard leaned in closer, his voice lower now, but each word fell into Marcus's ears as heavy as lead. Here, you are not a person. Remember that. Marcus nodded. He placed the timesheet back on the cart and picked up the pen to sign his name. The pen tip trembled for a brief moment, just enough for the ink to smear into a small blot, but his eyes did not. They remained calm, empty, like a lake, long accustomed to swallowing everything thrown into it. Richard glanced at the signature, and sneered. Good. Knowing your place makes life peaceful. He turned away, his leather shoes striking the floor with dry, echoing sounds that carried through the vast space. The remaining employees also filed out one by one, their conversations revolving around stocks, deals, and numbers Marcus was no longer allowed to touch. The room fell silent. Only the sound of the cartwheels and the swish of the mop dragging across marble remained. Marcus continued working, slow and careful, as if every movement were calculated to avoid disturbing anyone. When everything was clean, he pushed the cart into the long hallway leading to the elevators. The lighting here was softer, yet colder. Large framed photographs lined the walls, recording the history of Titan Finance, former CEOs, powerful faces, confident smiles frozen before the camera. Marcus stopped in front of a newly hung photograph, its gold-plated frame gleaming. Sophia Langford, the young, powerful female CEO, symbol of the new generation of leadership at Titan Finance. In the image, she stood straight, eyes sharp, lips curved, just enough to seem approachable, yet unmistakably cold. Marcus looked at the photograph longer than necessary, not out of admiration, not out of curiosity. It was simply an old habit from his days as an auditor, always studying the person at the top, trying to guess what they were hiding. He exhaled, turned away, and pushed the cart toward the elevator. The metal doors closed, carrying him down from the heights where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made, back to the role everyone believed was the only one he had. Marcus did not know that just a few hours later, the woman in that photograph would no longer look at him as a janitor. He did not know that a silent hand movement in the grand lobby would pull him back into a world he had tried to bury. And he did not know that from that moment on, lowering his head would no longer be the safest choice. The main lobby of Titan Finance at night carried an atmosphere completely different from the daytime when the last stream of people had left, when the automatic glass doors slid shut, and the security system switched to night mode. The vast space became so empty that even the smallest sound echoed clearly. The ceiling lights were dimmed, casting cold reflections across the marble floor, stretching out with every footstep. Marcus Reed slowly pushed the floor-cleaning cart through the center of the lobby. This was his final shift, the one few people wanted to take. But for Marcus, it was a rare stretch of quiet. There were no more contemptuous looks from the daytime, no deliberately humiliating remarks. There was only the work and the silence. He bent down, wiping away faint smudges on the stone floor, his movements steady, like a habit embedded deep in his body. His thoughts drifted to the small apartment in Brooklyn, where Jamal had probably finished dinner and was sitting there waiting for him, a hearing aid in his ear, eyes fixed on a television screen with the sound turned off. Marcus told himself he would try to get home a little earlier, even though he knew that promise was often broken by sudden orders. The sharp, hurried click of high heels cut through his thoughts. Marcus lifted his head just enough to make out a figure moving quickly from the direction of the VIP elevators. The sound stopped abruptly, as if the person had come to a sudden halt. Richard Kane's voice followed immediately, low but heavy with pressure. "You signed it, so don't pretend you're clean now." Marcus froze. The remark was not meant for him, but it was too clear to ignore. He shifted slightly to one side, the instinct of a janitor telling him to keep working and pretend he had not heard anything. But Richard's voice carried something different, not the usual daytime sarcasm, but tightly restrained tension. Sophia Langford stood facing Richard, her back straight, but her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Marcus, very quickly, then returned to the man in front of her. It was not the look of a CEO, annoyed at being challenged, but a probing look, as if she were weighing something. "Mr. Kane, this is not the place for this conversation," Sophia replied, her voice controlled, though it trembled slightly at the end. Richard let out a short, joyless laugh. He raised his hand, holding a glossy black Mont Blanc pen, its surface reflecting the lobby lights. "Do you think I'm stupid? Sophia, you signed the report. Everything leaves a trail. You think sitting in the CEO's chair makes you clean?" Marcus lowered his head again, pretending to scrub the floor, but his ears strained to listen. Words like report, signature, trail made something inside his mind twinge, dangerously familiar. He reminded himself that it was no longer his concern. Sophia took a deep breath. Her gaze swept toward Marcus again, this time lingering a little longer. In that brief moment, Marcus caught something unusual. Not arrogance, not anger, but fear, hastily concealed. Richard stepped closer, closing the distance between them. You should remember this. If I fall, you won't stay standing either. Sophia did not step back. She remained still, but her right hand moved slightly, very slightly. If one were not paying attention, no one would notice. Marcus noticed. Sophia's fingers moved in a familiar rhythm. A short, clear sign. Help me. Marcus jerked to a halt. The mop froze mid-motion, leaving a spreading streak of water on the stone floor. His heart began to pound harder, so fast he could feel it in his chest. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Sophia's hand, then her face. She was not looking at him, but her hand continued to signal, subtle and urgent. Help me. Marcus swallowed hard. In his mind, Jamal's face appeared. Evenings when father and son sat across from each other, using sign language to talk about the day that had passed. Those hand movements were so familiar to him that he understood them without thinking. Sophia changed the signs. Faster now. He has a weapon. Marcus felt the blood in his veins turn cold. His gaze snapped to Richard, then down to the Mont Blanc pen in his hand. A pen, a weapon. In that instant, he had no time to analyze, only to feel the level of danger Sophia was trying to convey. Richard was still talking, his voice echoing through the empty lobby. Don't think about playing the hero. Sophia, in here, I write the rules. Marcus set the mop down on the floor. The sound was soft, but it was enough to make Richard turn his head. He shot Marcus an irritated look, as if only now noticing the presence of an unwanted obstacle. What are you still doing here? Richard barked. Can't you see? I'm talking. Marcus straightened up slightly. Not much, just enough that his back was no longer bent. Sorry, Mr. Kane. I'm almost finished. Sophia glanced at him, her eyes flashing with a fragile spark of hope. Richard frowned, tightening his grip on the pen. Finish up and get lost. And remember what I told you this afternoon? Marcus nodded, but he did not bend down right away. His eyes passed over Sophia's hand once more. She gave a very slight nod, almost imperceptible, like a final confirmation. The Titan Finance lobby sank back into a heavy silence. 3 people stood in that vast space, each carrying a different thought. Richard believed he was in control. Sophia understood that one small mistake could destroy everything. And Marcus, the man, both of them considered invisible, stood at a crossroads he had tried to avoid for many years. No one in the lobby knew that Marcus understood every one of those hand movements. No one realized that in those few brief seconds, an invisible thread had been pulled tight, linking his buried past to a dangerous present. And no one knew that from the moment Marcus set the mop down. His role in this building had begun to change. Marcus stood still in the middle of the lobby. The distance between him and the 2 most powerful people in the building reduced to only a few steps. The ceiling lights shone down onto the marble floor, stretching the shadows of all 3 people, overlapping in an unsettling way. In that moment, Marcus felt the change in the air very clearly. He was no longer a janitor working the night shift, nor the invisible figure people were used to ignoring. He had stepped into a different space, where every sentence could carry consequences. Marcus spoke up, his voice low and clear, echoing through the empty lobby. Mr. Kane, please calm down. Richard Kane whipped around. In the first instant, pure surprise flashed across his face, as if he had just heard a table speak on its own. Immediately after, the surprise turned into loud, echoing, contemptuous laughter. Who the hell do you think you are? Sticking your nose in Richard's laughter reverberated throughout the lobby, bouncing off the towering glass walls. He looked Marcus up and down, his gaze deliberately lingering on the janitor's uniform as if to emphasize a point. Get back to mopping the floor before I fire you, Richard continued, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus did not step back. That fact surprised even him. Part of him was still warning that this was a dangerous boundary, that one wrong move could bring the troubles he had spent years avoiding. But the image of Sophia's trembling hand, signaling for help, was still etched clearly in his mind, like a signal he could not ignore. "I heard everything," Marcus replied evenly. The sentence abruptly cut off Richard's laughter. He frowned and took another step toward Marcus. "Heard what Richard asked?" His voice lowered, carrying a threat. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes flicking briefly to the Mont Blanc pen in Richard's hand. "Your conversation," he said. "And what you're holding?" Sophia stood motionless behind Richard. She looked at Marcus, then at the pen, then back at Richard. The confidence usually present on her face vanished, replaced by undisguised shock. "Mr. Kane," she said slowly. "That's enough." Richard did not turn around. He stared at Marcus, as if truly seeing the person standing before him for the first time. "You think you know something?" he asked. "You're just a trash collector." Marcus took a short breath. "That thing isn't a weapon," he said, his voice more assured. "It's just a recording pen." The space seemed to freeze. Sophia's eyes widened. For a moment, she looked at Marcus as if he had just spoken a forbidden truth. Richard tightened his grip on the pen, his fingers turning pale. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snarled. Marcus met his gaze. "A very cleverly disguised recording device," he continued, "used to store sensitive conversations, common in financial circles." Richard laughed again, but this time the sound was short and dry. "Where did you get that nonsense?" he said. "Who do you think you are?" Marcus did not answer right away. He simply said, "Mr. Kane, this is not the way to handle it." Sophia stepped forward half a step, her voice low but firm. "Richard, stop. We are not alone here." Richard turned toward her, his eyes cold. "Are you afraid of a janitor?" he said. "Or are you afraid of what's inside that pen?" Sophia pressed her lips together. She did not answer, but her silence was enough for Richard to understand that Marcus had touched a real weakness. He turned back to Marcus, his voice dropping. "Do you know what you just did?" he said. "You just signed your own resignation." Marcus nodded slightly. "Maybe," he said, "but I can't pretend I didn't see it." Richard stepped closer. Until the distance between them was only an arm's length, he leaned in toward Marcus's ear, his voice almost a whisper, but carrying familiar malice. "You will pay for today." Marcus clearly felt Richard's breath, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with anger. He did not move away. "I understand," he replied. A long silence followed. Sophia looked from one man to the other, feeling as though she were standing between two completely different forces. On one side was Richard, whom she knew well, powerful, ruthless, and willing to drag anyone down with him. On the other side was Marcus, whom only minutes earlier she had considered part of the background, now standing there with a frightening calm. Richard stepped back and adjusted his tie. "Get out of here," he said to Marcus, "right now." Marcus picked up the mop. The motion was so familiar, it was almost unconscious. He turned and pushed the cart toward the hallway, but each step felt heavier than before. Behind him, Sophia stood still, her eyes following him until his figure completely disappeared. As Marcus turned into a hidden corner of the lobby, he heard Richard speak, his voice low but filled with resentment. "You see," he said to Sophia, "even a rat will bite if it's cornered." Marcus did not turn back, but inside him, a clear thought formed. He had just crossed the last safe boundary of his life, and on the other side of that boundary, everything was far more dangerous. For the first time, Richard Kane realized that the janitor he casually insulted was not stupid at all, and that realization, though it came late, planted the seed of a rage that Marcus knew would not stop at mere threats. If you were Marcus, would you bow your head to live in peace, or step forward and invite disaster upon yourself? Comment with your choice. The main lobby gradually returned to its quiet state after Richard Kane left. The sound of his footsteps disappeared completely into the VIP elevator, leaving behind a heavy emptiness, as if the air itself had just been partially drained away. Marcus pushed the utility cart back toward the center of the lobby, bent down, and continued the unfinished work. The marble surface was almost clean, yet he wiped it once more, his movements slower than before, as if giving his mind time to settle. The confrontation from moments earlier still echoed in his head. Every word, every glance, Marcus knew he had done something he should not have done, according to the survival logic of someone who wanted to stay hidden, but now it had already happened, and the only thing he could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, the way he had done for many years. He gathered the small trash bags lined along the lobby and placed them on into his cart, sorting them out of habit. When he bent down to pick up one bag near the shared printer area on the ground floor, Marcus suddenly noticed something unusual. The bag was lighter than normal. Inside, instead of paper cups or cleaning wipes, were shredded pieces of paper, small and evenly torn, as if someone had deliberately ripped them very carefully. Marcus stopped. He opened the trash bag and sifted through the fragments. Numbers, lines of text cut in half, yet still enough to evoke a familiar feeling. A feeling he thought he had left behind on the day he walked away from the FBI. Strange, he murmured, his voice very low, as if afraid of hearing himself say it. He pulled the trash bag aside and stepped closer to the large printer set against the wall. The machine's screen still glowed faintly, indicating that a print job had not been fully completed. Marcus opened the paper tray below. A stack of paper was jammed inside, folded at the edge, as if someone had rushed away before dealing with it. Marcus pulled the stack out. It was a financial report, printed on high-quality paper, with the Titan Finance logo faintly visible in the upper corner. He glanced at the title, then down at the tables of figures below. At first, he intended to fold it up and throw it away, as was the duty of a janitor. But then, his eyes lingered longer than necessary. Those numbers were terrifyingly familiar. Marcus turned to the next page, his heart beginning to beat faster. Columns of expenses, internal transfers, and account codes laid out neatly and cleanly. To an ordinary person, they were nothing more than meaningless strings of numbers. To Marcus, they were a map. His pupils tightened. The auditor's instinct, the thing he had forced into dormancy for so many years, suddenly woke up with brutal force. "No way," he whispered. Marcus pulled the cart closer, using his body to block the view from the security camera on the ceiling. He did not do it consciously, but as an old reflex. His hands flipped through the report pages quickly, searching for irregularities, and then he saw them. Repeated expenses. The same spending purpose appears across multiple departments. Small amounts, just enough not to draw attention when viewed individually, but when placed side by side, they formed a clear pattern. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He took out a pen and lightly circled several lines. A transfer from the internal pension fund to an intermediary account. Then, from that account, the money flowed onward to a subsidiary, before disappearing into a series of personal accounts. The final beneficiaries' names were encrypted, but the transaction structure itself could not be hidden. "Bastards," Marcus muttered, the word coming out heavier than he expected. He leaned back against the wall and took a deep breath. Images of Titan Finance's lower-level employees surfaced in his mind. People he saw every early morning when they arrived ahead of schedule for their shifts, when they greeted him with tired nods. Their pension fund, the one thing that guaranteed a less uncertain future, was being slowly hollowed out, piece by piece. Marcus flipped to the final page. There, the approval signature stood out clearly. Not Richard Kane's, but the CEO's, Sophia Langford. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. The image of the woman standing in the lobby, her eyes pleading through sign language, overlapped with the image of the neat signature on the report. A disturbing sensation rose in his chest, a mix of disappointment and cold clarity. "So that's how it is," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. He stacked the report neatly and placed it back into the printer tray, but his mind was no longer there. The shredded paper pieces in the trash bag now carried a different meaning. Not trash, evidence that had been hastily destroyed. Marcus gathered all those fragments and stuffed them into a separate bag. He did not know what he would do with them, but he knew one thing for certain. They could not simply disappear like that. Footsteps echoed from the end of the hallway. Marcus flinched, quickly closing the printer cover and pushing the utility cart away. A security guard walked past, giving him a casual nod. Marcus returned the gesture in the same manner, his heartbeat gradually slowing as the man disappeared behind the door. He continued cleaning, but now every action carried a different weight. Every sheet of paper, Every trash bin could contain something far more valuable than it appeared on the surface. When the job was nearly finished, Marcus pushed the cart toward the service elevator before stepping inside. He stopped and looked up at the top floors of the building. There, the CEO's floor was lit, white light spilling out through the large glass windows. Like a silent reminder, Marcus stood still for a few seconds, his gaze fixed on that high floor. He understood clearly what he had just uncovered. This was not an accounting error, not an accidental system glitch. This was a carefully designed structure, a fraud network operating smoothly beneath the glossy exterior of Titan Finance. "This is a criminal system," Marcus said quietly, the words falling into the silent space. The elevator doors opened. Marcus stepped inside, carrying not only the utility cart, but also a heavy truth he knew would not be easy to put down. And as the metal doors slid shut, he understood that from this moment on, looking the other way was no longer an option. Marcus returned to the small apartment in Brooklyn when it was already late at night. The hallway lights flickered weakly, and the familiar smell of dampness lingered in the air. He set his tool cart aside, locked the door behind him, then stood still for a few seconds, as if to make sure he was in a safe place. Jamal was asleep, the bedroom door slightly ajar, the nightlight casting a pale yellow streak outward. Marcus looked at his son for a long while, then gently closed the door and turned back to the small dining table by the window. The stack of papers he had brought home was placed neatly in front of him. Marcus poured himself a glass of water, took a small sip, and then began reading again from the beginning. This time, he read more slowly, not to look for additional discrepancies, but to piece together scattered fragments into a complete picture. He flipped to the last page of the first report. In the lower right corner, the approval signature stood out clearly. Sophia Langford, the firm. Decisive stroke. The familiar style of someone accustomed to signing off on decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus frowned, his hand tightening around the paper. He turned to the next report. The same signature again. The same ink, the same slant, the same placement. Marcus took a deep breath and turned another page. And then, once again, that name appeared, like a cold knife cutting through him. "Not once," he muttered. Many times. Marcus laid the reports side by side on the table. Different dates, different expenditures. But the common point was unmistakable. Sophia Langford's signature appeared at every critical juncture, where the flow of money veered away from the pension fund, slipped through intermediary accounts, and then disappeared. Those who were supposed to be protected. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the stained ceiling. The images from the lobby of Titan Finance that evening replayed in his mind, one detail at a time. Sophia stood upright, her voice maintaining the necessary calm. Her eyes flicked toward him, quick and discreet. At the time, Marcus had thought it was the look of someone under pressure, searching for anyone who might help her escape a dangerous situation. Now, when he placed that look beside the signatures on the table, the feeling was completely different. In his memory, that gaze was no longer purely fear. There was calculation in it, a cold weighing of benefits and risks. As if Sophia were assessing whether an anonymous janitor could become a useful card, she knew everything. Marcus said quietly, his voice dropping. She knew from the beginning. He bent down and gathered the reports into a neat stack. His hand clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. An uneasy feeling rose in his chest, a mix of anger and bitter clarity. Marcus was no stranger to people like Sophia. In many years as an auditor, he had encountered more than a few senior executives willing to sign anything as long as it preserved their position and power. Marcus stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the city lights stretched on, glittering and cold. Wall Street was far away, but what was happening inside the Titan Finance building still seemed to cling to him, like a shadow that refused to leave. He turned back to the table, picked up a pen, and began writing down the key points. Cash flow, signatures, timing. Each detail was placed in its proper position. Like a familiar equation he had solved hundreds of times before, the more he assembled it, the clearer the picture became. Richard Kane was the one directly manipulating things, but Sophia Langford was not a coerced victim. She was part of the system, a crucial link. The person who legitimized everything with her signature. Marcus recalled the moment Sophia used sign language to ask for help. At the time, her gestures had been precise, perfectly correct. Not the clumsy confusion of someone unfamiliar, but the fluency of practice. That made him suddenly realize another detail Sophia had prepared. She knew she would need someone like him, or at least someone who could understand what she was trying to convey without exposing her. She's looking for a way out, Marcus said to himself, and she's willing to push someone else out front. He sat down, both hands resting on the table, his thoughts racing. If he stayed silent, everything would continue as usual. The pension fund would be drained until nothing remained. The workers he met every day would never know what had happened to their future. But if he acted, he would be facing not only Richard Kane, but also Sophia Langford, the one standing at the top of this entire system. Marcus glanced toward Jamal's room. The door was still slightly open, the night light steady. A sense of anxiety crept into his thoughts. Every decision he made could carry consequences, not just for himself, but for his son as well. The phone vibrated on the table, cutting through his thoughts. Marcus flinched and looked down at the screen. An unfamiliar string of numbers appeared for an instant, and then the caller's name followed, Sophia Langford. Marcus stared at the screen, without moving. His heartbeat slowed, each thud heavy. She was calling sooner than he had expected, as if she knew that he had seen what he was not supposed to see. The phone vibrated again. Marcus took a breath and picked it up, but did not bring it to his ear right away. He looked toward Jamal's room once more, then pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. "Mr. Reed." Sophia's voice came through the line, low and clear. "I think we need to talk." Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch for a few seconds, long enough for Sophia to understand that he was no longer someone easily led. His hand tightened around the phone as his mind rapidly reorganized everything he had just discovered. The woman he had once thought was pleading for help was now the one reaching out. And Marcus understood that this call would not be a simple explanation. It was the next move in a game of chess he had been pulled into, even though he had never wanted to play. Marcus arrived at Titan Finance headquarters earlier than usual the next morning. The atmosphere in the building retained its familiar sense of order and polish. But to him, everything now carried a different meaning. The wide hallways, the transparent glass walls, the glances that passed over him and then turned away, all gave him the feeling that he was stepping into a place that was no longer as safe as it once had been. He was directed up to the CEO floor. The elevator ascended slowly, each floor passing in silence. Marcus stood upright, his hands folded in front of his abdomen, the posture of a janitor summoned for unexpected work. But inside, his mind was racing, continuously rearranging the pieces he had gathered, preparing for any situation that might arise. The elevator doors opened. The CEO's office was at the end of the hallway, isolated and quiet. Sophia's assistant merely nodded, signaling for him to go in, then closed the door behind him. Sophia Langford rose from her desk as Marcus entered. She walked over, personally shut the office door, then drew the large curtains overlooking the city. The outside light was cut off, and the room sank into a soft yet secluded glow, as if everything here had been designed so that conversations would never escape beyond these walls. "Please, sit," Sophia said calmly. Marcus took a seat in the chair opposite the large desk. He studied Sophia, from the way she moved, to how she placed her hand on the edge of the desk, to the way her eyes never left him. The anxiety from the previous night was gone. In its place was the cold composure of someone who had already decided on her next move. Sophia smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Reed," she said slowly. "Or should I call you Auditor Reed?" Marcus froze for a moment. Even though he had prepared himself for this possibility, hearing his former title spoken aloud in this room still made his chest tighten. He did not ask how she knew. He understood that, once she addressed him that way, Every disguise had lost its meaning. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked, his voice low and controlled. Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Longer than you think," she replied. "Your file was not as easy to erase as you imagined." She turned back to her desk, opened a drawer, and took out a thick envelope. Sophia placed it on the desk and gently slid it toward Marcus. "I assume you have already seen part of it," she said, "but this is everything." Marcus did not open the envelope right away. He looked at Sophia. "You did not call me up here to show off what you know," he said. "What do you want?" Sophia let out a soft laugh, straight to the point. "I like that," she replied. "I want you to see everything clearly." Before we continue, Marcus opened the envelope. Inside were internal reports he had partially seen the night before, now arranged more carefully and more completely. Dubious transfer tables, streams of money routed through multiple subsidiaries, ultimately flowing into personal accounts. Richard Kane's name appeared repeatedly throughout the transactions, like a trace that could not be erased. "You see it now," Sophia said. "Richard has gone too far." Marcus turned to another page. "And your signature is here as well," he said, without looking up. Sophia did not deny it. "I knew you would say that," she replied, "and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She reached into the drawer again and took out another item, placing it on the desk. A sleek black Mont Blanc pen. Marcus recognized it instantly. A chill ran down his spine. "I took it from Richard's safe," Sophia said, her voice lowered. "One night, when he was drunk, convinced that the entire world was in his hands." She gently rotated the pen, then pressed a spot near the barrel. A very faint click sounded. Immediately after, a familiar voice emerged from the pen, clear and unmistakable. "You think I put you in the CEO chair because of your competence," Richard's voice said, dripping with contempt. "You sign. You live. You do not sign, and I drag you down with me." Marcus listened, his jaw tightening. The recording continued, with Richard talking about manipulating the books, about siphoning money from the pension fund without attracting attention, about forcing Sophia to sign falsified reports to cover up gaps amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. Every sentence was a vivid, naked piece of evidence. Sophia switched off the recording. The room fell silent once more. "That is why I need you," she said, her voice lower now. "An outsider. Someone who is no longer inside this system." Marcus looked up. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Sophia leaned back in her chair. "Expose Richard," she replied. "Bring all of this into the light. Make him take responsibility." "And you?" Marcus asked. Sophia met his gaze directly. "I was coerced," she said. "I will leave Wall Street after this is over." With a non-disclosure agreement and compensation sufficient to start over, Marcus gave a quiet laugh, devoid of any amusement. "You want a clean exit," he said, "and I stand on the front line." Sophia did not argue. She stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of Marcus. "You understand this system better than I do," she said. "Without you, everything will be buried. The people who lost their pension funds will never know what really happened." She lowered her voice, almost to a whisper. "Right now, you are the only person I trust." Marcus looked at Sophia, then back at the documents on the desk, the Mont Blanc pen lying motionless between them. In his mind, Jamal's face surfaced again, along with the workers he saw every day, people who had no idea their futures were being traded away. He understood the choice before him all too clearly. If he took the envelope and the pen, he would step into a battle whose outcome no one could predict. If he refused, Richard Kane could continue, and Sophia would find another way to protect herself, no matter how many people she had to trample. Marcus closed the envelope and placed his hand on the desk. He has not answered yet, but in his eyes, Sophia saw something that made it impossible for her to turn back. Marcus understood that if he accepted, he would walk into hell. If he refused, everyone would lose everything. Do you think Marcus should trust Sophia or expose everything? Comment with your choice. Marcus left the CEO's office without saying another word. The door closed behind him with a soft but decisive sound, like a period at the end of a conversation that both sides knew could never be reversed. The hallway leading to the elevators was long and quiet, the lights reflecting off the stone floor in cold streaks. Marcus walked slowly, feeling as though each step weighed heavier than the last. Inside the office, Sophia Langford leaned back in her chair, both hands resting on the surface of the desk. She followed Marcus's silhouette through the frosted glass until he disappeared completely. Only when she was certain he was gone did she speak, her voice steady and free of hesitation. "You only need to submit the evidence. I'll handle the rest." Marcus stopped just before his hand reached the door handle. He turned his head and looked at Sophia once more. "And you?" he asked, his voice direct and without detours. Sophia tilted her head, her lips curving into a thin, carefully practiced smile. "I'm a victim who was forced to sign," she said. "Richard controlled everything. He gave me no choice." Marcus looked straight into her eyes. His gaze carried no sudden anger, only the cold clarity of someone who had seen too many similar scenarios. "You signed many times," he said slowly. "Not once, not twice." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The smile vanished from Sophia's lips. For a few seconds, the two of them stood in silence, as if testing each other's limits. Sophia stood up, walked around the desk, and moved closer to Marcus. "You think you understand everything," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You have no idea how much balance I had to maintain just to avoid being crushed." Marcus did not step back. "I know what a signature means," he replied, "and I know who it took things from." Sophia took a deep breath, then spoke through clenched teeth. "Don't forget who you are," she said. "A janitor, a man without an official record anymore. If this explodes in a way you can't control, you'll be the first one swallowed." Marcus did not argue. He glanced down at the thick envelope on the desk, then reached out and took it. The papers inside felt heavy, not just because of their volume, but because of what they represented. He turned and headed for the door. "Read," Sophia called after him. Marcus stopped, but did not turn around. "Don't betray me," Sophia said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I chose you because I believed you were smart enough to survive." The door closed. Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment longer, letting his breathing return to normal. He understood clearly that Sophia's words were not just a warning, but an unspoken promise. From this moment on, every step he took would be watched, measured, and, if necessary, erased. He stepped into the elevator. The metal doors slid shut, reflecting his face in the dim mirror. A face calm enough to be unreadable, but behind it, calculations were already forming. Marcus knew he had just shaken hands with the devil, but he also knew that in the dirtiest games, the one who survives is not the strongest, but the one who prepares the best. The elevator stopped on a lower floor. Marcus stepped out, blending into the sparse crowd of the late afternoon. He held the envelope close to his body, an old habit from his days of carrying sensitive evidence. In his mind, each piece of information was being reorganized not to serve Sophia's plan, but to build another path entirely. On his way back, Marcus stopped at a small coffee shop on a street corner. He chose a secluded table, ordered a black coffee, and set the envelope down in front of him. He opened it again, reviewing each document, the figures, the signatures, the margin notes, everything aligned, all pointing to a single truth. Richard Kane was the manipulator, but Sophia Langford had allowed it to happen. "She doesn't need justice," Marcus murmured, as if speaking to himself. "She needs an exit." He recalled Sophia's eyes when she spoke her final line in the office. They were not the eyes of someone placing trust, but of someone making a wager. Marcus folded the documents, slipped the envelope back into his bag, and looked out through the cafe window, where traffic flowed steadily, as if the world had no idea what was unfolding behind those glass towers. The phone in his pocket vibrated lightly. Marcus did not take it out right away. He waited until it vibrated a second time before glancing at the screen. A short message, no sender name, just a few words. "We need to talk soon." Marcus turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He finished his coffee, stood up, and left the cafe. On the sidewalk, the wind blew harder, carrying a chill with it. Marcus pulled his collar up and walked with an even pace. In his mind, a plan had begun to take shape, step by step, careful and discreet. He understood one thing clearly. From this moment on, both Richard Kane and Sophia Langford had reasons to want him gone, not because of what he had done, but because of what he now held. And in this world, silence is sometimes purchased with violence. Marcus walked faster, merging into the crowd, his eyes constantly alert. He knew he was standing between two forces, ready to tear apart anyone who stood in their way. But he also knew that once dragged into this game, the only way out was to go all the way through on his own terms. Marcus returned to the apartment when the city had sunk deep into the night. The lights outside the window flickered without any rhythm, casting scattered streaks of light across the ceiling. He set his bag down on the table, took off his coat, then stood still for a few seconds to listen. There were no familiar small footsteps, no clattering sounds from the kitchen, only a prolonged silence. Instinctively slowing his breathing, he switched on the small desk lamp by the window and pulled out a chair to sit down. The envelope Sophia had given him was still intact in his bag. Marcus took out each stack of documents, lining them up neatly. His hands moved very quickly, yet without haste. Every motion was precise, as if he had done this hundreds of times in the past. The laptop was opened, the scanner placed flush against the edge of the table, and the cables arranged neatly. The pale blue light from the screen reflected on his face, highlighting the fine lines around his eyes. Marcus began copying. Each page of the reports slid through the scanner, producing a steady humming sound. The financial tables appeared on the screen, sharp and complete, no longer fragmented pieces. He named each file carefully, encrypted every folder, and organized everything in chronological order. Cash flows, signatures, intermediary accounts. Everything was assembled into a chain that could not be denied. Throughout the process, he did not pause to hesitate. Hesitation was something he did not allow himself. The original Mont Blanc pen was set aside separately. Marcus took a soft cloth, wrapped it carefully, and then placed it into a small, shock-proof box. He closed the lid, sealed it with tape, handling it with the care one would give to something fragile. It was not just a pen, it was a voice, a confession, a door that could either open everything or slam it shut. When the copying was complete, Marcus leaned back in his chair and glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. He opened an encrypted messaging application and entered an old contact. A name appeared on the screen. Someone who had once been his colleague at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Someone who had known him long enough to understand when to ask questions and when to stay silent. Marcus attached the encrypted files, checked everything one more time, then sent them. No long explanation. Just a short line. Documents for review. Anonymous source. The message was sent successfully. Marcus waited, eyes fixed on the screen. A few minutes passed, longer than he expected. Then, the phone vibrated lightly. A brief reply appeared. Received. Marcus let out a long breath, but it brought no sense of relief. He knew this step was only the beginning. From this point on, everything would move, according to the momentum of a machine far larger than himself. But at least, the truth was no longer held solely in his hands. He shut down the laptop and placed the box containing the pen into the lowest drawer, behind rarely used items. Then he took out his phone and opened a photo of Jamal. The boy was smiling, one hand raised in a familiar sign, his eyes bright behind a new pair of hearing aids. The photo had been taken a few days earlier in the park near their home. Marcus stared at it for a long time, as if he needed to memorize every detail. He typed a message. "Dad will be home late." A simple sentence, but a habit between father and son whenever he had to work overtime. Marcus knew Jamal would read it when he woke up, or, if he was still awake, he would reply with a familiar hand symbol. Marcus set the phone down, stood up, and put his coat back on. The old apartment building's elevator let out a soft sound as it stopped on his floor. Marcus stepped out into the long, narrow hallway, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. He walked slowly, ears tuned to every sound. Every door he passed was tightly shut. When he reached his own apartment, he sensed that something was wrong. The door was ajar. Marcus stopped. A cold emptiness opened up in his chest. He reached out and lightly touched the doorknob, feeling the chill of the metal. The door was unlocked. He pushed gently, opening it a little more, producing a faint creak. Inside was pitch dark. The nightlight in Jamal's room was not on. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He did not turn on the light right away. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The living room was tidy, too tidy. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, just an excessive silence, as if all sound had been drained from the apartment. "Jamal," Marcus called softly. There was no response. He moved faster, heading toward his son's bedroom. The door stood wide open. The bed was empty, the blanket neatly folded. The desk was clean, books arranged in order. Jamal's hearing aids were not on the desk where they usually were. Marcus returned to the living room. His heart began to pound harder, more urgently. He switched on the light. Bright, white light flooded the room, exposing everything clearly. On the small dining table lay a piece of paper, placed neatly, as if someone had deliberately left it there. Marcus stepped closer, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the paper. The handwriting was messy, yet decisive, terrifyingly familiar. There was no signature. He read it, his eyes racing across each line. Every word struck him straight in the chest. There was no need to speculate, no need to ask further questions. The message was clear enough. Marcus let the paper fall back onto the table. The apartment remained silent, but the silence now carried a different weight. He turned his head, looking around, as if Jamal might appear from some corner, but the room was empty. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Marcus pulled it out and looked at the screen. An unknown number. He took a deep breath and brought the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice low. On the other end of the line, a soft laugh sounded, hoarse and slow. Richard Kane's voice followed, clear enough that Marcus could picture the smile on his face. "Looking for your son, janitor hero." Marcus closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "Where is he?" he asked. Richard laughed louder. "Relax," he said. "We will talk. Alone. You bring what I need." The call ended. Marcus stood motionless in the middle of the apartment, the bright lights shining down on the cold floor. In that moment, all calculations and all plans fell away. Only one thought remained, sharp and clear. He was a father, and he was not allowed to lose. Marcus stood in the middle of the apartment. The ceiling light was still on, yet the space felt cold, as if the light could not truly reach it. The call had just ended, but Richard Kane's hoarse laughter still echoed in his mind, each syllable clinging like the lingering smell of smoke. Marcus did not move right away. He needed a few seconds to steady his breathing, to keep panic from seizing control. He looked around the apartment once more, slowly and carefully. The dining chair had been shoved out of its usual position, one leg pushed far back, as if someone had stood up in a rush. Marcus stepped closer, placed his hand on the back of the chair, and clearly felt a fresh scratch in the wood. Jamal was always careful. The boy never dragged a chair like that. That small detail was enough to confirm what Marcus had known the moment he entered the apartment. On the kitchen table, a brown envelope lay placed directly in the center. No attempt to hide it. No sign of haste. Whoever left it wanted him to see it immediately. Marcus picked it up, feeling the thick, dry paper beneath his fingertips. The envelope was not sealed, only loosely folded shut. He opened it. Inside was a white sheet of paper, folded in half. The handwriting was messy and heavy, as if the writer did not care whether it looked neat, only that it was clear enough. Marcus read each line slowly. "Want to see your son. Bring the pen." There was no signature. There was no need for one. Marcus knew exactly who had written those words. He folded the paper and set it back on the table. For a brief moment, his hand trembled slightly, then quickly tightened. He did not allow himself to lose control for long. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Jamal's number. Once, twice. The screen displayed the familiar words, but now they carried a completely different meaning. The number could not be reached. He tried again, then again. The same result. Each ringing tone felt like another cord tightening inside his chest. He set the phone down on the table and sat in the chair, his hands clasped together. In his mind, the options began to surface, overlapping and colliding. Hand over the pen, hand over the evidence, exchange it for Jamal, or hold to the plan and trust that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would intervene in time. But Richard Kane was not the type to wait for justice. He was the type who created his own rules. The phone vibrated on the tabletop, softly, but enough to make Marcus flinch. An unfamiliar number appeared. He stared at it for a few seconds, then answered. "Hello?" Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. On the other end of the line, Richard laughed. The hoarse laughter stretched out, as if he were savoring every second of the conversation. "Looking for your son." Trash-collecting hero Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Where is he?" he asked, without preamble. "Calm down," Richard replied, his tone as though speaking to a child. "Everything is fine, if you know how to obey." "Stop talking in circles," Marcus said. "What do you want?" Richard chuckled softly. "I already told you. The pen. Just the pen." Marcus did not answer right away. He looked toward Jamal's room, where the empty bed lay motionless. "And my son," he said. "I need to hear his voice." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Richard laughed louder. "You are not in a position to make demands," he said, "but I will be generous. He is still intact." Marcus tightened his grip on the phone. "Where do we meet?" 11 o'clock at night, Richard replied. "The underground parking garage beneath Titan Finance." "Alone," Marcus said. "Of course." Richard laughed. "Alone. Trash-collecting hero." Marcus heard a faint clinking sound on the other end, like metal striking metal. Then Richard's voice dropped, carrying an undisguised threat. "1 minute late," he said slowly, "and I send your son back piece by piece." The call ended. Marcus placed the phone back on the table and stared at the darkened screen. In the small apartment, the silence grew thick and heavy. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. The city was still moving. Cars still passed by. People still lived their lives, completely unaware that in a small apartment, a father was being forced to face the cruelest choice imaginable. Marcus returned to the table, opened a drawer, and took out a small box containing the original Mont Blanc pen. He set it in front of him and stared at it for a long time. The pen lay still, harmless, on the outside, yet inside it held confessions capable of bringing down an entire financial empire. And now, it was also the tool Richard Kane was using to bind him. Marcus clenched the pen in his hand. The cold edges of the metal pressed into his palm. He remembered his years working in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the cases he had pursued, the moments when he had been forced to weigh evidence against human lives. He had thought he would never have to face that choice again. But life did not care about what people wished to avoid. He set the pen down, grabbed his jacket, and checked his phone again. A new message appeared from the same unknown number. "Do not try anything. I am watching you." Marcus let out a quiet laugh, without a trace of amusement. He knew Richard was watching, or at least wanted him to believe so. He wanted him afraid, wanted him to feel that every escape route had been cut off. Marcus stepped out of the apartment and locked the door behind him. The hallway was long and narrow, the lights still flickering. Each of his footsteps echoed clearly and steadily. In his mind, another plan was forming, not entirely aligned with what Richard expected. He walked down the stairs and out onto the street. The night wind blew hard, carrying a chill that seeped into his skin. Marcus stopped beneath a streetlight and lowered his head to look at his hands. His fingers were clenched so tightly that his fingernails dug into his skin, leaving pale white marks. Pain. But this pain reminded him that he was still alert, and that, even though Richard Kane had chosen to strike at his son, he had not yet won. If it were you, would you hand over the evidence to save your child, or trust that justice would arrive in time? Marcus stopped beneath the awning of a closed shop, the streetlight casting down and splitting his face into stark patches of light and shadow. The night wind blew harder, but he barely felt the cold. In his mind, now, every thought converged on a single point: Jamal. He pulled out his phone and searched for a name that had not appeared on his screen in a very long time. A former colleague from the FBI, someone who had worked with him on the most sensitive cases, someone who understood when a brief call could carry life or death significance. Marcus pressed call. The phone rang twice, then the other end picked up. "Marcus," the voice came through, tinged with surprise. "I need your help," Marcus said immediately, without preamble. "Monitor my phone tonight." A brief silence. "What's going on?" "No questions," Marcus replied, his voice low but firm. "Just monitor it. If everything goes as planned, you'll understand." On the other end, the man exhaled softly. "You always know how to come back at exactly the worst moment," he said. "All right, I'll do it. Thank you." Marcus said. He ended the call before any further questions could be asked. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and straightened up. The decision had been made. From now on, every step had to be precise. Marcus knew well that Richard Kane was not the type to leave openings by accident. If he had chosen the underground parking garage beneath Titan Finance, it was because he believed that place was under his control. Marcus took a taxi, asking the driver to drop him several blocks away from the Titan building. He did not want to arrive too early. When the car drove off, Marcus blended into the sparse flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk, heading toward the familiar glass building. Titan Finance at night looked different from the daytime, more massive and colder, like a gigantic block of steel driven deep into the earth. The entrance to the underground parking garage was at the back of the building. Marcus walked down the gentle slope, fluorescent lights mounted on the ceiling, casting broken patches of light. The vast space echoed with the sound of his footsteps, each one steady and clear. He glanced at his watch. It was almost time. At the center of the garage, a black SUV was parked sideways, the engine off, but the headlights still on, shining straight toward the entrance. In that light, Marcus saw Richard Kane leaning against the hood, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his posture relaxed to an infuriating degree. Two burly men stood on either side, each gripping one of Jamal's arms. Marcus's heart tightened. Jamal's hands were tied behind his back, his mouth sealed with gray tape. The boy could barely stand, forced to lean against one of the men. Jamal's eyes were wide with panic, darting around the dark garage, then suddenly freezing when he saw Marcus. Marcus slowed his pace, one step at a time, as if afraid that a single sudden movement might cause everything to shatter. He raised both hands to chest level, making sure Richard and his men could clearly see that he carried nothing but his coat and a small bag. On time, Richard spoke, his voice echoing through the wide space. "I like people who keep their word." Marcus did not look at him right away. His eyes were locked on Jamal. "Let my son go," he said, his voice low but taut. Richard laughed, a short, dry sound. "Easy now," he replied. "Everything is exactly as agreed. The boy is just collateral." Marcus clenched his teeth. "You have what you want," he said. "Now keep your word." Richard shrugged. "We're not at that step yet," he said. "Are you always this impatient?" He signaled to one of the men to shove Jamal forward slightly. Jamal stumbled, nearly falling. Marcus moved instinctively, but stopped immediately when Richard raised a hand. "Stay where you are," Richard said, his voice turning cold. "I don't want any misunderstandings." Marcus stopped, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles made a faint sound. "You said the FBI wouldn't come," he said. "Are you sure?" Richard burst out laughing. "The FBI abandoned you," he said. "If they cared, you wouldn't be standing here alone." Marcus did not respond. He unlocked his bag and slowly took out the small case. Under the garage lights, the Mont Blanc pen appeared, glossy, black, and cold. Richard narrowed his eyes, a flash of greed flickering through his gaze. "Put it down," Richard said. Marcus stepped closer to the SUV, each step carefully calculated. He placed the pen on the hood, between the two of them, positioning it directly in the beam of the headlights. The metal reflected the light, like an invitation. "That's what you want," Marcus said. "Now let my son go." Richard looked at the pen, then at Marcus, then back at Jamal. He clicked his tongue. "You really are a good father," he said. "Too bad you're so naive." He stepped forward, his hand reaching out. In that moment, Marcus felt every sense stretch to its absolute limit. He noticed every small movement, every glance from the two men, every sound echoing through the garage. Richard picked up the pen. His fingers closed around it, gripping it tightly as if afraid it might vanish. A smile spread across his face, a smile of satisfaction and cruelty. Finally, Richard said, his voice laced with pleasure, "I knew you'd do the right thing." Marcus looked straight into his eyes, unflinching. In that gaze, Richard briefly sensed something that caused his smile to slow, but he was far too intoxicated by his victory to stop. The pen rested securely in Richard's hand. His smile widened even more, echoing through the cold underground parking garage, as if everything were now completely within his control. Richard Kane held the Mont Blanc pen in his hand like a trophy. He rotated it under the fluorescent lights of the parking garage, letting the glossy black barrel reflect cold streaks of light. His gaze was intent and unhurried, savoring every second. In that moment, everything seemed to stand still, leaving only the faint sound of distant engines and Jamal's ragged breathing behind the tape sealing his mouth. "You're really stupid," Richard said, his voice low and drawn out, as if lecturing a child. "I knew you'd bring it. Every father does." Marcus stood facing him, both hands clenched at his sides. He looked at the pen, then at Jamal. The boy's eyes were locked onto him, panicked, yet still trying to remain calm. Marcus gave a very slight nod, a movement almost imperceptible, just enough to let Jamal know he was there. Richard stepped closer to Marcus, the pen still in his hand. "Kneel," he said, as if issuing a command to an animal. "Right in front of your son." Marcus did not move. He felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but his face remained composed. Richard tilted his head, the thin smile fading. He raised a hand in signal. One of his men stepped forward, placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, and shoved hard. Marcus lost his balance for a brief moment. Then his knees hit the cold concrete. The sound was soft but clear in the vast space. Jamal flinched, struggling, but was restrained even more tightly. "Apologize to me," Richard said calmly. "Say it, so your son can see you know your place." Marcus lifted his head and looked at Richard. There was no pleading in his eyes. "Let him go," he said, each word heavy and clear. "You already have what you want." Richard burst out laughing, loud and hollow. "You still don't understand," he replied. "What I want isn't the pen. I want you broken." He turned toward Jamal and gave a nod. One of the men shoved hard. Jamal lost his balance and fell onto the concrete, his shoulder striking violently. The cry was muffled behind the tape, reduced to a choked, broken sound. "That's enough," Marcus roared, his voice cracking as it echoed through the garage. Richard stopped, looked at Marcus, then laughed even louder. "Too late," he said. "You chose to step in here, so you accept the rules." Marcus bowed his head for a brief second, as if taking a breath to keep himself from exploding. When he looked up, his eyes were completely different. Gone was the cautious restraint of a man backed into a corner. What remained was cold focus, the kind of gaze that had once silenced others in sealed interrogation rooms. "You just made a mistake," Marcus said, his voice low and firm. Richard frowned, the smile on his lips slowing. "What mistake?" he asked, still trying to maintain his contempt. "You're kneeling at my feet." Marcus did not answer right away. He swept his gaze across the garage, past the dark corners where concrete pillars stood in rigid rows, past the motionless parked cars. Then he looked back at Richard. "You think I came here alone?" he said. Richard laughed, but this time it was short and strained. "Don't try to scare me," he replied. "This is my territory." Marcus took a deep breath. "Territory doesn't make you invisible," he said, "and the pen in your hand isn't the only thing recording tonight." Richard tightened his grip on the pen. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus shifted his gaze to Jamal and made a very small hand signal, just enough for the boy to see. It was the sign the two of them used when they wanted to say, "Stay calm." Jamal looked at him, eyes wide, then blinked lightly in response. Richard noticed the movement, still playing games. He snarled, "You think those little hand tricks are going to save anyone?" Marcus did not reply. He slowly braced his hand on the ground and stood up, even as one of the men immediately stepped forward to block him. Marcus stood straight, facing Richard. The distance between them was now only a few steps. "Step back," Richard ordered his men. "I want to talk alone with this garbage hero." The two men hesitated, then stepped back half a pace, still keeping Jamal within reach. Richard moved forward, the pen still in his hand, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "What are you planning to do?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus looked straight at him. "Wait," he said. Richard was about to laugh, but at that moment, something changed. An engine roared at the far end of the garage. Then another, and then many more, all at once, as if the entire space had just awakened. Richard turned his head. Headlights from multiple vehicles switched on simultaneously, cutting through the darkness and shining straight into the center of the garage. The blinding light forced Richard to raise a hand to shield his eyes. His men startled, reeling in the sudden glare. Marcus stood still, unblinking, the light reflected off his face, highlighting the hardened lines Richard had never noticed before. In that moment, the underground parking garage was no longer Richard Kane's stage. The headlights continued to blaze, dense and cold, like a declaration that needed no words. The headlights continued to shine directly into the center of the parking garage, making the already cold underground space harsh and suffocating. Richard Kane stood frozen, the Mont Blanc pen in his hand reflecting the light like a sharp, icy cut. He narrowed his eyes, trying to see through the sudden beams of light closing in on him from all sides. Then, the sound of shoes pounding against concrete echoed from multiple directions. Rapid, yet disciplined, figures emerged from behind the pillars, from the ramps, from behind the motionless parked cars. Dark jackets, familiar badges displayed on their chests. FBI, drop the weapon. The command rang out, firm and absolute, allowing no hesitation. Richard snapped his head around, his eyes widening. That is impossible, he blurted out, his voice completely breaking. That is impossible. Two of his men reacted on instinct. One released Jamal and reached toward his waistband. But before he could do anything, he was taken down. A clean, twisting motion, the sound of metal hitting concrete. Everything happened so fast that Jamal had not yet understood what was going on. Marcus did not move. He stood there, in the center of the light, his face calm to the point of coldness. Only when an agent approached did he speak, his voice low and clear. The child is here. Understood, the agent replied shortly. Richard took a step back, his gaze darting between Marcus and the gun barrels aimed at him. You played me, he screamed. You tricked me. Marcus looked straight at him, not flinching. The pen is fake, he said. The original has been with the FBI since the afternoon. Richard looked down at the pen in his hand, then back at Marcus, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. No, he shook his head. That is not possible. An agent stepped forward and snatched the pen from Richard's hand. The agent rotated it slightly and removed the cap. Inside was empty. No recording device. Nothing at all. Just a harmless shell. Richard screamed. A hoarse, broken sound. You think you won? He shouted. You think these people can save you? Marcus stepped forward one pace. I do not need to be saved, he said. I need this to end. Another agent approached Marcus and gently pulled aside the edge of his jacket. A small microphone was neatly secured inside, its indicator light blinking faintly. The agent nodded to the others. We heard everything clearly. Richard went slack, all the aggression drained from his face, replaced by pure panic. No, he muttered. No, this cannot be. His arms were wrenched behind his back, handcuffs tightening around his wrists. Richard struggled weakly, then screamed in despair as he was pushed toward an FBI vehicle. Sophia will not let this go, he shouted. She was involved, too. Marcus heard him, but he did not turn around. His eyes were now fixed on Jamal. An agent carefully removed the tape from the boy's mouth and untied his hands. Jamal staggered for a moment. In a day. On when he saw Marcus, he ran toward him, stumbling halfway, but forcing himself back up. Marcus dropped to his knees and opened his arms. Jamal threw himself into his father's embrace, clinging tightly, as if letting go for even a second would make everything disappear. Marcus held his son close, feeling the boy's trembling heartbeat, feeling his rapid breathing gradually steady. He slowly made familiar, deliberate hand signs. Dad is here. It is all over. Jamal nodded, tears spilling over, but he did not cry out loud. He only held on tighter. Around them, the underground parking garage had become a fully secured scene. Agents moved swiftly, taking notes, collecting evidence. Richard Kane was escorted away, his screams fading behind the door of the vehicle as it slammed shut. Marcus stood up, his hand still resting on Jamal's shoulder. An agent approached. Mr. Reed, the agent said, we will need you to come with us to give a statement. Marcus nodded. After my son is safe? Of course, the agent replied. Jamal was led out of the garage, wrapped in a warm jacket. Marcus walked beside him, every step lighter than when he had entered this place. When they reached ground level, the night wind swept past, carrying fresh air, as if the world had just been opened again. In the days that followed, the story exploded across the media. Titan Finance became the center of a flood of news reports. Richard Kane was charged with large-scale financial fraud, embezzlement of pension funds, kidnapping, and threats to human life. The recordings, testimonies, and money trails were exposed layer by layer. And then, the the name Sophia Langford began to appear in the investigative files. At first, there were discreet questions. Then came subpoenas. Her signatures on the reports were examined line by line. What Sophia had once believed could be buried through silence and backroom agreements was now no longer within her control. Marcus followed everything from a distance. He did not appear before the press. He gave no interviews. For him, attention was not the goal. The goal had been achieved the moment Jamal was rescued safely. One evening, as father and son sat at the small dining table in their apartment, Jamal looked at him and slowly signed. "Will you go back to your old job?" Marcus smiled. A tired but relieved smile. He signed back, "I will help when needed, but what matters most is here." Jamal nodded and smiled. A full, genuine smile Marcus had not seen in a long time. Out there, Wall Street continued to operate. Glass towers remained lit. Numbers continued to race across screens. But somewhere, a criminal system had been broken, not by power or money, but by the quiet preparation of someone once considered invisible. The news continued to spread. Investigations expanded. Other names began to surface, and among them, the name Sophia Langford was no longer mentioned as a powerful CEO, but as part of a story of collapse. Justice is not wiped away by hands wearing white gloves. It is turned over by those willing to pay the price so that the truth is not buried. Who do you think is the real villain in this story? Richard or Sophia? Press, subscribe, and comment with your choice.